of Supervisors meeting, recorded October 6, 2020.
Kayla. It's 5 o'clock. We'll call the Portage County Board to order. Roll call. We're missing Supervisor Chai Mua, and we're going to do a roll call, and the clerk will call the roll.
Supervisor Reeser.
Here.
Hano.
Here.
Rukowski.
Here.
Soik.
Here.
Haga.
Here.
Gifford.
Presente. Here.
Dubek.
Present.
Splinter.
Here.
Bobby.
Here.
Leddick.
Here.
Neville. Here. Matt Jakowski.
Here.
Dodge.
Here.
Gussel.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
Jankowski.
Here.
Ande.
Here.
Mua.
Did she say here? Bua? Oh, okay.
Moresi.
Here.
Martinson.
Here.
Medine.
Here.
Morrow.
Here.
Pataki.
Here.
Barry Jakowski.
Here.
And Zastro. I think he was on.
Here.
Zastro.
There he is.
All right. We have 24 present and 1 excused. Supervisor Mua.
Pledge allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Invocation by Supervisor Barry Jakowski.
Good afternoon, fellow colleagues. In these days of new normals and challenging times, I would ask that we keep in our thoughts and prayers the men and women of our law enforcement, firefighters, EMS personnel, whom risk their own personal safety on a daily basis to ensure our personal well-being. To close today, the meeting directly after the passing of former Supervisor Dale O'Brien, I was unable to attend. So today I would like to say just a few words in honor of Dale. Excuse me, everybody. We've all heard it said that you can count the true friends on one hand, a person you can trust your life with, help out whenever asked, and defend you whenever needed. I firmly believe no truer statement has ever been made. And with the loss of Dale, I have lost one of my fingers. Rest in peace, Dale. Amen.
Amen.
Move, review and approval of September 15, 2020 County Board minutes. Motion by Supervisor Dubek, seconded by Supervisor Laddick. Any corrections or changes? All those in favor with aye? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Minutes are approved. Correspondence? None. Members of the public who wish to address the county board on specific agenda items must register their requests at this time with such comments subject to reasonable control of the county board chair as set forth in Robert's Rules of Order. Nobody from the public is here. And okay, I see Supervisor Mua is on now. Very good, thank you. Next item, presentation, County Executive Holman, State of the County Address, 2020 Budget Presentation.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and thank you, Mr. Chair. So it's that time of year again where I get to come and talk about the state of the county as an organization and its budget. And as you all know, it's been an exceptionally challenging year with the virus from, it's probably February moving on. And I'll touch upon that as we work through the handouts that are in front of you. And After I go through this, then Jenny will also take you through the budget in brief, and then we can make sure and answer any questions you have. I spend a lot of time these days talking with our peers in the region, whether it be Central Wisconsin or East Central or even North Central, and based on the feedback I'm getting from them, a lot of us are experiencing the same difficulties, whether it be with responding to the virus or fiscal challenges associated with it, the things that people are going through, or deficits that we've had to confront and figure out how to overcome. And earlier this year, the forecasting, the kind of prognosis of where we were headed was pretty doomsday-ish in the sense of where people thought it might go. So thankfully, I can say that for us here in Portage County, and for at least the folks I've talked to in our region, they have been kind of significant six-figure sort of deficits, but not as bad as everybody thought. So very thankful for that. I think that sometimes under a levy limit policy, it feels like we're pulling a rabbit out of a hat every year. I think that maybe this is a year the rabbit's gone and we kind of tip the hat up and we've knocked all the magic fairy dust out of it. So I'll touch upon some ideas I have for next year and kind of looking forward. But first, I want to just kind of run through some of the procedural pieces just as reminders, because we talk about this every year, but it's good to just remind ourselves of where we're at. So obviously we're getting the budget presented today. Next week you'll have a meeting where there won't be formal amendments made there, but you can certainly refer things to committee for further review. And I would really recommend that if you have questions or things you'd like to change within the budget, that you do refer it to whichever committee is relevant or germane to what you're looking at, just so that the committee process can do its thing and bring that conversation to the Finance Committee on the 26th, so that they can review those formal amendments. And then any amendments that come to the floor on November 2nd, where you entertain the adoption of the budget, they've been fleshed out a little bit more. And that helps everybody, I think, in the process understand where folks are coming from. And it keeps us from having to try to, iron out the wrinkles on the fly on the 2nd. So I certainly encourage you to engage the process if you see the need to. And again, as a reminder, it's like our fiscal framework is just kind of referencing how does the county, how does finance kind of view where we're at with the process of the budget. And I wanted to just start here by saying that the budget's a living document. It can always change. Sometimes people feel like it's static and unchanged once it's adopted. Now, it's always changing over time. But this year, probably more than any other, the budget in front of you reflects only what we know today. And there's just so much uncertainty out in the world that the projections are kind of a moving target in some regards. And so I think we kind of got to be flexible with how we see how the world might engage us as we try to engage it. Obviously, we exercise reasonable care in all of our decision making and not placing us under necessary risk. So the decisions that I'm making as we work through this process is trying to minimize all of those things. And similarly, we all have a fiduciary duty that requires us to keep an objective mind, stay honest, responsible, and efficient. We don't have problems with that, but again, it's just a good reminder. Now, when it comes to the context that we're operating within, especially these days with the response to the virus, and the economy and all the scaffolding of crises that everybody's dealing with, there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty, which I referenced at the federal and state levels. And just to remind you, last year I noted that the federal deficit passed $1 trillion in September, so the month prior to me talking to you. But this year, as of right now, the federal deficit's looking around $3.5 trillion. So obviously that's a huge swing in terms of deficit, and it's going to frame how the federal government continues what it does and how that trickles down to us through the state. Obviously, with the economy being the way it is, stagnant in its recovery and very fragile, our investments, something that we've relied upon for funding some things over time, are going to be less reliable. There's going to be more of a challenge with them because of the unease in the markets and the economy in general. I've talked about it a lot already, but the state has revenues that are down. That's going to give a lot of challenges to the legislature and the governor when they try to work something out for the next biennial budget. And I've mentioned it again before, but I'm just mentioning it here now because the pots of money that are available to them to try to make up the difference are few and far between. So most likely you'll be expecting to see some cuts to the K-12 system, UW system, but also to shared revenue. Counties will certainly be able to expect some degree of cuts in shared revenue based on where things are today. Municipalities have a bigger pool to draw from, so it's potentially more of a hit for municipalities, though we're all interconnected, as we know. So as we look to move through that context, we're going to need to be flexible with how we manage this budget and future budgets, because there will likely be some need for contingency requests, and I'll touch on that again. And it'd be remiss to not also note that the people we provide services to, the public, they're also being hit very hard by all of this, and the burdens associated with the crisis are not being felt evenly. They're not evenly distributed through society, and so there's going to be some kind of feedback from all that as well, because women and minorities and low-income individuals are all suffering disproportionately in the crisis. So that's something that is going to frame a lot of the work that our departments do. So when it comes to some of the budget assumptions, clearly the budget's focused on preserving the financial integrity of the county. It is balanced and there's no structural deficit. So we're saying all those things because those are very important in the process. As you probably know or remember, the operating levy was limited to a 1.124% increase. Then you have some gobbledygook about TIDS, 0.0001%. Previous year, less an adjustment for the personal property tax aid. Long story short, the overall net increase for us was that $312,989. So that number is going to get stretched across the entire county. Also, the budget includes a reduction of roughly $400,000 in tax levy support for capital projects. So that's one of the mechanisms we use to fill the gap for this year. And in the future, we are going to want to try to figure out how do we put the money back into capital from levy. And that's, I'll talk about it in a little bit, but I think that this was not the year to really drill down, because everybody's still reacting to things on the fly. But as we get our feet underneath us a little bit more, I think we'll be in a better position to really drill down into some of the bigger decisions that are going to face the county. The 2021 levy per 1,000 equalized value, the tax rate ended up at $5.23 per thousand. You can see on the sheet there that there were increases across the board for all the different levies, whether it be operating, the healthcare center referendum, debt service, the EMS levy, and bridge and culvert aid. So those increases are there. The total levy is roughly $33 million, and that's up from $5.18 last year. And on the next page, you'll see, and I just wanted to kind of show you where we've been the last 10 years, is that the average of all these numbers is $5.19 per 1,000. So 523 is on the higher end of that, but it's certainly not the highest. It's not the lowest. We're sitting in that same spot, which is not surprising, again, given the levy limit policy and how we approach this. But you can also see in the bottom right-hand corner that the median home value is paying $854 in tax per year to the county. Things to keep in mind. I've referenced uncertainty. I'm going to reference unknowns now because there are so many of them, and many of them are potentially associated with some larger price tags. So at the top of the list, you see the healthcare center. There's a lot of different conversations happening there, but many of the paths that can take can be associated with funding questions that we're going to have to find answers for. Similarly, the infrastructure of the county in general. We all know that. It's been discussed at length, but it's another one of those things that's hanging out there in orbit around all of this that sometimes it's easy to lose sight of because we're not necessarily talking about it every day, but what you do see and start to see more of are the increased costs for maintenance and repairs. So that's probably across all of our facilities and just in general, that you're going to see more of those costs if we don't resolve some of the other questions. One of the biggest unknowns is the 2021 COVID-19 response. So there were a lot of pools of funding that came down to the county and counties and different agencies from the federal government and the state to help with the response in 2020. A lot of that funding doesn't go through after the end of the year. So there are huge questions being asked right now by everybody involved to figure out what happens next. There's also the question of the 2021 economy. I started off by saying that this year people thought it was going to be pretty bad. Now people are starting to talk about, is next year, 2022, is that going to be the time frame where the economy takes more of a dive or continues to stagnate, or any other sort of challenge gets brought to the fore that we'd have to grapple with? Those things have big impacts on the decisions that are made at levels above us that impact what we have to work with. The page on debt service, I think, is just important to point out because this usually comes up when we talk about building projects and the like, but you'll note that generally speaking, the county is still in an incredibly good debt position. Yes, you have an astronomical amount of available debt that we would ideally and hopefully never ever get even close to. But the fact that we're still looking at 95% availability, 96%, is reflecting the decisions that we're making as a part of this budget process to position the county so that if and when we need to go into debt for something, we're able to do that without it posing bigger challenges to the debt service levy, which in turn would be bigger challenges to the public. So there's a lot of anticipatory decisions being made here that are setting the stage. They're not necessarily predicting that there's going to be decisions made where we go into more debt for a building or a renovation or whatever it might be, but it's just important to know that we've been in this pattern for a while. But you have that space to work with as well when you're contemplating any of these things in your various committees, or just when you're talking about any of the projects that have come up over the years. So the 2021 capital improvement plan projects and funding, I did note that we took levy funding out of capital improvement planning, and what that meant is that fund balance went in. Now, thankfully, based on county policy, once we get over a 25% threshold where there's excess fund balance and a surplus, that can go into capital improvements, and that's what was what happened. So in the bottom paragraph, you see that described, in that $358,000 from 2019 in excess was transferred into capital improvements to help shore that up. And similarly for this year, based on our estimates, we're looking at roughly $500,000 doing the same thing for the same reason, being a surplus beyond the 25% county policy for this area of the budget that then gets funneled in capital improvements. So the nutshell of that is that policy and the surplus that was generated in the budget in 2019 and this year is helping feed the capital improvements plan, which is where we took the levy funding from to then solve some of the other problems in other areas of the budget. At the top there, I note that there's IT upgrades. These were things that, had the county moved in a direction at any time in the near past that building something, maybe part of that discussion would have focused around where would you put IT for part of that project. But as all things are with IT, there's a certain period of time where then you're at end of life, and everything, as we know now, especially now, runs out of that department. So the upgrades, we pushed the envelope. We added a year beyond end of life on this. So this was the year where it had to happen. Similarly with the CAD system through Sheriff's Office and the joint arrangement we have there with the city and the village and law enforcement and EMS and fire, that has to go through as well for many of the same reasons. So you'll see that just those two projects are somewhat anomalous as these projects go, in that they were a little over $2 million. So that was something that we grappled with within the capital improvement plan, but we tried to narrow it down to the things we knew had to happen based on all the things I just told you, plus a couple things that were smaller funding amounts, but also had to happen. So some revenue highlights. I mentioned it before, so I won't belabor the point too much, but sales tax has outperformed everybody and every economist in the state's expectations. No one understands exactly why or how it did it. Those questions are still being asked, but At the end, the projection now is it will probably be roughly 160,000 short of last year. So not a wild deviation from expectation. So a big shock, but also a major boost to the budget because this was one of the areas where the anticipated drop was going to be significant. Also, I mentioned the funding that we have received, and so I wanted to explain because a lot of this funding, though it didn't offset revenue and doesn't account for everybody's time doing everything, we have received almost $3 million in contracts related to our COVID-19 response. Now, had that money not been there, might not have spent $3 million, but we would have spent a significant amount of money as a part of that response. So that's why 2021 and the funding questions around what happens next year with COVID-19 and counties and municipalities at all's ability to respond, that's why it's such a big question. Will we have to pick up more of the tab for next year out of our own fund balance just because we know that it's not there anywhere else? For county employees, it's just a few bullet points, but we were able to keep in the budget the steps within the salary plan as well as a 1% growth in the plan. So we had lots of conversations about that with committees, and we kept it on the table, just saying we want to try to do this, and ultimately we were able to do it. So that was a big plus, especially considering, there were a few layoffs earlier in the year in certain departments, but by and large, most county employees were working through all of this. And, to be very frank, some of the unemployment was very helpful for people, but it was also, in some cases, probably more than what maybe somebody was making in their job at the county. And so being able to do something small like this because they stayed in that and didn't demand something else, I think was important. The health insurance fund, which has historically been pretty strong. I know there's been ups and downs in the past, but the last few years, it's been strong. That's a big help for employees. And there's a surplus there, which we actually try to spend the surplus, if you recall, because it's getting to a point that's more than you want to have in there. So having another surplus is good news. It's also reflecting less claims than anticipated. So also good news there. I mentioned there were a few layoffs. Telework obviously continues and will continue. And with some of the layoffs, there were people who also did some redeployments throughout the county. So there were people from the ADRC or Clerk of Quartz who went to work at the healthcare center or worked at public health doing contact tracing, things like that. So anyone who found themselves in that position, we made sure had the opportunity at least to redeploy to another department. Similarly, the state has a work share program, which kind of balances time that people work and then time that people are not working and pays. Again, it's not like the unemployment that was early on in this, but it's another tool that departments have had to use. And so it's good to have that tool. I know the Clerk of Quartz has used it, and we've also made sure that all departments are aware that it's there for them. Non-county agencies, I'm repeating myself here, but in 2018, looking at the budget, my message to them, they all do an exceptional amount of amazing work in our community. But from my point of view, looking at the accounting side, I just wanted to communicate that, in my opinion, the county, given the levy limit policy and just our difficulty with paying for organizational things, was not a reliable source of funding for non-county agencies. And so I'd recommended cuts last year that I thought brought things down. I mean, they were big cuts, right? But the whole point was that when I looked at some of the operational budgets, they're not my budget, but that's the point. I don't want them to be my budget or yours. I don't want the county to be a disproportionate size of anyone's budget, but I still think it's important that we support these entities. So the approach that we use for this year is the kind of extension of what we did last year in terms of dropping people down to different levels. So I think most people drop down to $2,000. The business council is going down to $25,000, I believe, and then that would complete that two-step plan for these agencies. I will say here too, I didn't want to put it into the budget, but this has been an exceptionally difficult year for these community-based agencies as well, and we certainly don't and haven't funded many of them ever. And also some of them did not get the CARES Act funding like others did, the Business Council being one of them. So an idea that I'll bring to finance as part of 2020. I'm not bringing it as part of this budget because I think it's cleaner, but it's just the idea of saying, is there an opportunity within the 2020 budget to maybe give some additional support to them because they do so much work with us on a number of fronts, but also because of the virus, a lot of the money that they make for their budgets is through fundraising events and in-person things where lots of people come to a location and do something together. They haven't been able to do any of that. So, in one case, an organization is missing out on almost $400,000 because they weren't able to do their two big events of the year. So that's a huge challenge for them. Now, luckily, this organization has got a little more robust budget, but that's certainly not going to be true for every single non-county agency that we've interacted with. And I mentioned it last year too, but state statute also kind of frames the way that counties can interact with non-county agencies. So we have to keep that in mind, and I will when I bring that to finance. So moving to some department highlights. I'm leading off with planning and zoning because even after this meeting, there's a land and water conservation meeting where a lot of the conversations have been around water. And water is a perennial issue here. We talk about it quite a bit. And the budget's always had $5,000 in there for the testing that we do across the county. So not knowing where some of those conversations were going, I thought, well, I added another $5,000 to say, at a minimum, it's going to help with the water study that we do. And if there's work that's being done, like the nitrogen budgets or any things that the county staff needs some funding for that there'd be a little bit there to start with. Similarly, and a little bigger would be the separate handout that was alongside the packet you had. And if you at home, if you don't have it on the screen, that's okay. I'll just run through it real quickly. But essentially, it's this year I included funding for membership in the North Central Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, I was really curious why Portage County wasn't a member. So I started talking to everybody I could that had anything affiliated with that organization for as long back as I could find people, and no one had an answer. So I spoke with their executive director several times, tried to figure out what it is that you do. Why is it that counties participate in this? And based on my understanding of those conversations, I think what this organization can bring to the county is multiple things, but the two big ones are they essentially complement the work of planning and zoning departments in every county that is a member of that organization. So it can free up time for some of the departments if they have something unique that they need to do. It can also be something that municipalities can work with this commission to do projects that are unique to whatever they're looking at. And it still costs the municipalities a little money, but it's a much reduced level of funding for that. So, but it's a unique opportunity for them to help them with their planning as well. And on top of that, the other piece of this is that they're an economic development district. And so people often ask the county, what do you do for economic development? So being a member in this organization means that municipalities, businesses, individuals, the county itself can all have access to a unique pool of federal funding that nobody was able to apply to in the past. So that's one of the answers the county can have in terms of how are we trying to support economic development in Portage County, but also in this region. And more, the economic questions of the day are not local as much as they are regional. So it makes sense too that we would be speaking to all of our peers in different counties in our region more often. The membership fee for that is roughly $40,000. It's based on a formula that's set in statute and based off of equalized value. The handout goes into that a little bit. But if you read through that handout, it gives you a really nice overview. And if you have any questions about what it is and why, feel free to reach out to me, or Dennis Lawrence is their executive director. I'm sure he'd be happy to answer any of the questions you had as well. in planning and zoning, there's also going to be an increase of roughly $250,000 because they have some grants for some runoff management grants and some healthy lakes grants, which is good. You know, there's a lot of smattering of different studies and work that's going on in the county related to the water, and the land conservation section certainly does a lot of it. Moving on, I wanted to touch on Clerk of Quartz. Primarily because they're representative in a way of where the courts are at. And this year, a lot of things have been put off. So revenues and expenses were down, and there's probably in many areas the return to so-called normal will probably be slower than the Clerk of Quartz would wish, or the DA for that matter, or the judges. But the point of including this one as the highlight is that there's a tremendous amount of work that's being backlogged. And while revenues and expenses may have been down this year, there's a good chance that as that work comes back onto the docket and they start working through it, probably at a faster pace than usual, the expenses and revenues that are generated by that process will increase, and probably not equally. So there's a good chance that there will be higher expenses as the court system and the county's part of that works through the backlog. In general, there's just been a significant decrease there with fines, forfeitures, penalties, everything associated with it. And I know the courts are, inching closer towards their sense of normal and bringing jury trials back, things like that. I think they're looking towards maybe the beginning of the year, but that's an ongoing conversation, but something to keep an eye on, especially for judicial general. Also, the ADRC, you'll just see there that they've just been challenged left, right, and center this year because the population of people they deal with are the most vulnerable population in Portage County. So they haven't really been able to open a lot of the portions of the things that they normally do. So, and coupled with that, there's been decreases in funding. They've had some increases in areas where they've been able to actually meet some needs. And probably the biggest one is with Meals on Wheels and delivering meals out in the county to folks who sometimes these individuals bringing meals are the only people they see the whole week. So that was a huge focus early on. It continues to be. But I just wanted to point out that if you see numbers in the budget and ADRC looks somewhat confusing, a lot of that is because, one, it's a complicated agency with a lot of different revenue streams, but two, it's been one of the disproportionately affected departments in the county because of the virus. Similarly, solid waste, I wanted to just touch upon the situation they've been in now for a couple of years, but we know that there's projected deficits in recycling. That tends to get worse. So there's still a surplus in a transfer facility, which is helping to balance that out. But the solid waste board is having to explore other options to figure out what are some longer term solutions to these immense challenges that they're faced with. And it's not anything that we've done, it's just the industry as a whole. And of course, on top of that, you've got waste management buying out advanced disposal. So there's a degree of uncertainty there in terms of how that's going to impact the solid waste world in Wisconsin. The healthcare center, very important to bring up for all the reasons you would suspect. They have also been really impacted by the virus. Generally speaking, the trend in long-term care has been going down, but they have a lot of business, at least in the last year or two, of people with more short-term stays. And sometimes that's due to the nature of why the person is there. Maybe they're getting some rehab for a hip surgery or something like that, or also because of managed insurance programs where you only get to be there for 3 or 4 days and then you go. So that world is changing quite a bit. So just wanted to point out that because of the trends that you're seeing there, and also just what people are choosing to do, staying at home longer, things like that, they're experiencing some big decreases in the revenues that are coming in through the services they provide. There's been some very good conversations at the last couple meetings around the CLA study, CLA being who we work with on auditing and budget and everything else, and this issue here. And that has helped position the committee to look at the options on the table and start picking what are they going to explore, why, how are they going to look at those. And, it's really a pressing issue. It's been pressing for probably at least 6 years, I'd say. But now we know we have a referendum. We know the referendum works through 2022, but we also know that any position that the county would take on this would take time. And most likely, depending on which path is taken, you're going to need another successful referendum to fund that, for all the reasons I've been talking about earlier in terms of the deficits we're experiencing in general, deficits because of the virus, levy limit policy, like all of these things are constricting counties more and more and more every year. You have less resources to do more work. I just wanted to mention that, because I think it's important for you to know that if the referendum failed as a hypothetical, that there's still net assets at the healthcare center where they could operate for 2 years, roughly. So I think it's just good to mention it, because I don't want people to think that if the referendum didn't work and that would just then put everybody into a panic mode. There are net assets at the facility, so even though the committee's hot on the issue, they're discussing it and moving things forward, which is exactly where they need to be. There's still a bit of a cushion at the end, but that we shouldn't take that for granted. Real quickly, just want to touch on the business park. There's only a few properties remaining out there, and a lot of people don't realize it, but it's kind of like a HOA in that the routine maintenance and fixes that are done out there, we pay, but then the people who own acreage in the business park pay back into the pot of money for that work to be done based on the number of acres that they have. There's very few lots left. I mean, we've lowered the price on them. We're trying to move them because I think everybody would just like to put a bow on it and walk away and let the business park do its thing. And lastly, or almost second to last, I wanted to note that for highway risk management is purchasing an attenuator. And if you don't know what an attenuator is, just think of it as a thing that absorbs the kinetic energy of a vehicle hurtling towards people who are working on the road and saves their lives, ideally. It gets in the way of vehicles. And why are we having to buy an attenuator? It's because county residents, a few of them anyway, continually hit our really big, really orange trucks who have really big arrow signs saying, move over there. Nevertheless, this is, last winter we had several hits. Now we've already had 2 hits this year for summer work. So we're trying to give them more resources to at least protect them if that sort of thing is going to continue to happen, because we certainly do not want any injuries out there.
I'm going to interrupt there just for a second too. Everybody got the pictures we had forwarded of the accidents with that. I was on Highway B yesterday and I watched a car get right up on the back of one. It had signals to go on both sides. Right there at B&R intersection, and that person looked like they were confused when they got there, and I could see it for a quarter mile. We had someone have their mirror taken off too on I-39 plowing because a semi went by and got that close. So it's very dangerous out there on those folks that are working on the highways. So thank you, Chris.
No, thank you too. One of the last things I want to talk to you about is a 2022 budget task force. And this is kind of building on the budget prioritization process that I started a couple years ago. And it's answering the question of how do you pull in the different pieces to then really take a deep dive on fiscal policy, make recommendations to the Finance Committee and the County Board to say, here are some fiscal policies that can help frame all of the fiscal decisions that we need to make so that when these situations arise, whether it's large deficits or the need to address something unexpected, that we have a really robust set of tools to rely on that we've all put in play for ourselves, but of course everyone after us who will hopefully thank us for our work. It's also to take the hard look at all the discretionary funding in the budget, because that's the primary area, again, not knowing what the state's going to do, of where we can maneuver funding, move it around to try to address the situations that we're faced with. Because it doesn't take long before the county gets faced with kind of existential questions with some of these programs. And it's the big questions like, what is Portage County going to do or not do, and why? And kind of bring that wrapped up in a fiscal perspective to the committees and the board to kind of, again, lay the groundwork for the decisions if and when they need to be made, and I say it every year, but there's an inevitability to it because the policy does not seem to be changing at the state level and nothing gets cheaper. But also what I'd like to do is have the task force move the thinking from year to year to beyond just a 1-year budget picture. What does 2 years look like? Can we do a biennial budget where we have one budget that we accept and one budget that's kind of building off of that one? What about looking out 5 years? What are things we know we're going to be confronted with just based on what we know today? And try to prepare for those again. So moving forward, we know, I've said it, but it's...
Chris, do you have any ideas on the structure of the task force you're thinking? Can you touch on that for a minute?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll submit a formal memo to the finance committee and the board. I mean, obviously I want your buy-in to the concept, but it essentially would be like myself, finance, human resources, on your side, same thing, chair of finance or designee, chair of HR designee. That's the real rough idea. Initially, I included the chair of the board too, but then you've got a quorum from exec ops, so we gotta juggle that around. But yeah, that kind of core anyway. And then the way I would envision it is that as different issues came up, you would just pull people in for that conversation when it happened, and that way you have people who are doing the lion's share of the work and moving that process forward, but then pulling people in to provide the nuance for the recommendations that come to you.
Yeah, thank you. Chris and I talked about this a little bit, and I just wanted to make sure the rest of you have some idea to think about it as well. So,
yeah, no, I just think it's a good way to formalize, a broader participatory process where more fingerprints are on the things that people are confronting, and that there's more of an awareness in general amongst all of us in terms of where we're at from a financial perspective. Beyond that, it's like, I just reference it again because the uncertainty that's out there there's way more questions than answers right now. And again, I mentioned it earlier, but the next budget, or maybe the next couple of years of budgets, could end up becoming more challenging than this year for the reasons I've mentioned, in the sense that there's not funding. There might not be the same level of funding, most likely won't be, but the challenges might still be there. But last but not least, a very big thank you to the finance department staff. They really carry department heads and all of us through this. So Jenny and her people are doing an amazing job. Also to the department heads, everyone on staff, and to you on the county board, because we all take a step back. We take this discussion seriously. And I think that even coming into this position, it was clear that you guys were having very constructive conversations about the budget. And I think that that's continued. And I just appreciate everybody's contribution to it because it's such a fundamental part of what we do.
Supervisor Machikowski.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for your budget presentation. The first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to thank you for taking the 1% cost of living increase, as you can call it, from your original proposal of 0%, and putting that back in for our employees. Our employees show up every day, and they are truly an asset to us. The other question I have, I've asked this question at various meetings, county board meetings throughout the last probably 5-6 years. I want a number of what the county loses a year due to tax incremental districts. Now, I've heard that's anywhere from 100,000 to 300,000 to 1 million to 3 million, and no one can get me a number. And I'm assuming no staff can get me that number because I haven't had it yet, and I've been asking for it year after year after year. We need to find somebody that can get us our number. I realize knowing that number is not going to fix our budget, but if we start talking to legislators and saying, hey, we as a county are losing 3 million, 100,000, whatever it be, to these tax, we need to look at reforming those. And I realize it's a statewide issue, and I've looked online. I did the old Google search. How do you figure out? There are so many formulas out there. Like I said, you can come up with a $30 number and you can come up with a $30 million number, depending on what expert you talk to. But somebody at the state, somebody at some level somewhere has to have that number for us. Or is it magical?
Well, there's some degree of magic involved because a lot of it is kind of hope in a sense that the development will happen and provide the funding for the projects and so on and so forth. But I know there's a few TIDs that I think are nearing completion or closer. So it might be worth looking at them to kind of, because then you'd actually have some hard data to look at, and then you could apply. I mean, you probably have to do it every single year, but apply the budget math to each of those years and then pull out a value, and then it'd still probably be an estimate, just because, like you said, the formulas are all pretty convoluted. But I do agree with you too that, and it's something I brought up with the DOA and DOR when I've spoken with them, and just others in economic development conversations of, if TIDs are going to continue to be there and counties and school districts are going to continue to have to, lose in a sense in that arrangement, then is there ways to change what that funding can even be used for, right? And maybe there's things what, one idea I've given them is, why wouldn't, if you had a business park you wanted to create, just as a hypothetical, allow the TID funding to create like a solar array that actually generates revenue, and through the revenue you get savings back to the people through the same kind of TID arrangement. So they get their savings, but the county or whoever gets an asset, and then at the end of that arrangement you're just generating revenue moving forward. And when I brought that idea up, people's eyes get kind of wide, and it was actually someone from the PSC I was talking to about that as well, and but there's still no traction with it. But so, interesting idea, but I think that people are looking at, even knowing that the tool is not going to go away most likely, how can we change the way it works?
I would be happy with even an estimate.
Okay.
Jenny, do you want to say something? You're looking at me.
There's a document that we use for apportionment of county tax levy that includes in it the increment values that I can send to you.
Okay.
It doesn't tell you what the lost taxes are, but it'll tell you the equalized value of those increments that are at in those TIDs. So that's what the municipality will use to tax and collect for their developments.
So we can.
The other thing that, and I remember you asking this question last year, and I had a long conversation with Nathan Sandwick, because he's done a lot of research behind this. And to get the value is a tough question to answer. But the other thing that I would just say, with my experience with TIDs, is it might be beneficial to get a municipality in here to do some basic education and some other things, because they use them way more than we do. And I think of one that probably would be pretty good to do that, but they could probably provide some framework.
And of course they use them because it's an advantage to them and a disadvantage to us.
Correct, but I think the workings of it, they might be able to give us some baseline and talk more about the financial model a bit.
That would be
but
great.
This document I can share from the Department of Revenue.
Please do.
Supervisor Medine.
We have commonly, I think, gotten the 3-ring binder at this time, which has the detail. And I don't know if we're going to get that, but the reason it's kind of important to have that, on page 9, we talked about transferring some from the unassigned budget balance of the general fund. In this one, we do have the general fund, but we don't have the unassigned, so it's hard to draw the conclusion to be able to look at that and see on one page how that works out. So I don't know if we're going to get that this year or not.
Jenny's going to speak to that, actually. It was a discussion that she and Al had about what to bring you, but she can also speak to the fund balance piece. I mean, if you have a specific question about
It's
it.
just one of many
Okay,
items that are in there.
sure, yes, yep.
Jen?
Well, I missed the clack of the notebook as it falls on the
Yeah.
floor.
Pretty knocked over their stuff.
Yeah.
Jen, do you have an answer to that yet, or?
I'll answer when I start my presentation.
Oh, okay. Supervisor Gifford.
Yeah, two things I wanted to highlight that I thought were really good in this. On page 13, the decision to join North Central Regional Planning Commission. I went to a workshop a couple WCA conferences ago. It was called go regional or go home. And they focused on the things that they do in those commissions. And I think when we got into the water quality task force, where the meetings all over the state, it forced people to look at the fact that, watersheds are a regional thing. It's not just your city or your county, it's a whole regional thing. And then the reports that we get from Forward Analytics, I always read through those pretty thoroughly, and all the counties in our regional planning area have the same demographic problems, right? Aging out population, difficult with getting new workforce to come in. We have a workforce shed problem where we're going to get workforce from. So that's a good thing, and it's really not that expensive to belong. And I think we'll see some benefits from that. And then on page 18, where you say expanding our thinking beyond year to year, as long of a time horizon as you can work within, I think the better, and the more macro your view. In other words, think globally, act locally, that old slogan, right? So those are two highlights I like to see in this.
Anybody else have any questions for the exec? Anybody at home have questions, comments? Nope. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Executive Holman.
Thank you too.
Jenny Josie.
So just to start with Dave's question, this year we've decided to hand out the budget and brief presentation to the board. Everything else is on the county's website, the budget document itself. And then we were going to direct board members that if they wanted specifics about what's in the budget document, they can get it from the website. If someone has any other special needs, they can contact our department and request copies from us if you need them. But the document is loaded on the website tonight. You can go out and access it. The budget and brief is also there as well. And I can answer specific questions about the general fund because that information is in the budget and brief that we handed out tonight. First, I want to echo what Executive Holman said. I want to thank the department directors for their cooperation in this budget process. They really were truly outstanding in getting a budget done on a short timeline. We started late. We had tried to end early, and they really did their part. I also want to thank the Finance Committee. We've had a lot of long meetings, a lot of conversations, a lot of times with little information and a lot of unknowns, and they were very helpful with listening and providing input along the way. And I do need to thank the finance staff. They are a tremendous group of people. I am honored to work with them, and they make this happen every year. So they do an outstanding job. And thank you for being here and putting up with my presentation. Some of it will be a little bit redundant because I really do think that some of the things that I will talk about again are really the backbone of this budget, and I think they're very important takeaways as we move forward. A little bit about the budget. I just want to say that it's balanced. It doesn't create a structural deficit. We're always looking to budget for adequate resources to meet our budgeted obligations. We always want to balance the necessary funding to meet the needs of the public while recognizing the taxpayer's ability to pay for that. Revenues in this budget from the state for various grants and such that we receive, for the most part, remain flat unless we knew differently going into this budget process that it should be something else. Many of the COVID-19 grants that we received in 2020 are not included in 2021 unless we knew that they were coming. Investment income was estimated to decrease as a result of what's happening in the current market. that's been happening since the outset of COVID-19. And you'll hear me say a lot of times, because of COVID-19, I feel like a broken record every time I say it, but it has had a really large impact on this budget. And again, personnel costs did reflect a 1% annual adjustment to the county's wage and classification plans. All other county benefits in this budget, for the most part, remain flat. Knowing that COVID-19 and the county's response is going to continue on into 2021. We did use fund balance in the Health and Human Services budget in the amount of $300,000 to better prepare for contingency plan of being able to meet their needs as they start the new year. I'm hopeful that we will receive some other money from DHS, but at the time of putting this budget together, we only knew of one grant that was expected to come our way, so we felt it in our best interest to add a little bit more. The healthcare center, of course, reflects the full referendum amount of the $1.4 million. That's the first time that we've levied the full amount. We also plan to use $168,000 roughly of fund balance, or their unrestricted net assets, to balance their operational budget in 2021. Sales tax collections are estimated to decrease just over $20,000 over the prior year's budget, and that's due to COVID-19. And the capital improvement budget has a tax levy decrease to support capital improvements, of which we've replaced with fund balance from excess in the general fund. So with that, the budget in brief has a nice summary message from the county executive. The next couple of pages are a community profile that give you a little information about our county, who our major taxpayers are, what our major businesses are, school districts, and so on. We have an organizational chart that kind of lays out the county departments and operations. That has not changed. That's the same as the previous year. The next page is a summary of the 2021 county tax levy. This is exactly what Executive Holman pointed out earlier, just to let you know that the types of levy, the operating levy and the healthcare center referendum levy, even though they're spread out, those both are subject to the levy limit. It's just that one falls under referendum, and I thought it would be a little bit easier for you to look at it if they were separated out in categories. Any money that's not spent under that levy stays with the healthcare center. It doesn't go to county operations. Overall increase in the taxes for 2021 is $1,575,068. We are in compliance with the levy limit, and again, for illustration of what this would mean to a median home value in Portage County, which is roughly $163,300, it would mean a tax bill of $854.06. Now, keep in mind that that's based on your municipal taxes and assessment ratio, so that's a kind of a broad round number. When you get your tax bill, if that's the value of your home, it might not be that number. So please don't call me and say that's not what my tax bill was. For the countywide budget, the overall budget went down 0.92%. Our modified budget includes in it many budget amendments related to COVID. When we receive the types of grants that we did this past year, that increase that budget, we're expecting that to go down in 2021. Just to kind of go through a couple highlights in these classifications for revenue. The number that I just gave you on taxes was different than what it shows here. That's because there's other categories of taxes: sales tax, interest on taxes, vehicle registration fee is considered a tax. Those numbers went up as well. For instance, a vehicle registration fee we're estimating will be up $100,000 based on our current experience on who's registering. And interest on taxes, we bumped up $40,000 based on current estimates. Intergovernmental revenue went down. Those are related to grants, and that would be primarily COVID-19 related grants for Health and Human Services and ADRC. The routes to recovery funds is not amended in the budget yet, because as we go through this process, we're not sure we know where we've spent some of the money, but we haven't spent it all yet. So we don't really know where the need's going to be to where we're going to spend it and where we're going to bill it to. So we've made some estimates in the actual projected budget column, but we haven't amended the budget for that per se. Licenses and permits, that has to do with licenses for Health and Human Services through the Environmental Health Department. Fines, forfeits, and penalties went down due to Clerk of Quartz projected revenue due to COVID-19. They're experiencing a decline. Public charges for services did go down again. The majority of that number is related to the healthcare center. When we looked at their census and we looked at what kind of revenue they're bringing in currently, that number went down almost $975,000. The other factor in here is the Health and Human Services Department no longer has a school health contract with the Stevens Point Area School District, so that was over $200,000 as well. The miscellaneous revenues had a slight adjustment, and we are not anticipating any note proceeds in 2021. We have no plans to borrow money at this time. I know we're talking about other large projects, but nothing is definitive at this point to budget for any type of debt issue. Expenditures by classification, this just breaks out expenditures across the county in the different types of areas. Those expenses are in. Public safety, costs went up basically due to staffing, some EMS provider increases. Public Works, the increases there would be due to the construction schedule at Highway. Health and Human Services has some reductions due to the removal of some COVID-related expenses, as well as the school nursing contracts that we had. ADRC had a decrease related to the budgets, primarily in personnel. And Healthcare Center also would have had some decrease in personnel costs as well. Conservation and Development had some increases. They're projecting in land conservation some larger grants in 2021, so that would have driven up their expenses a bit. On the next page is the 2021 budget summary by fund. What this is intended to do is to give you a couple things. A look at what the projected fund balance is at the beginning of the year for 2021. Now keep in mind, this is taking into account all our estimates that we're doing for 2020. So this is not going to be the number, it's going to fluctuate a bit, but this is our best projection as of today. It's intended to give you what that projection is going to be at the end of the year, and also lay out for you the property tax that's in each of those funds as well. You can see that overall countywide, we're projected to have a fund balance of $83.5 million, including our enterprise and internal service funds. And at the end of 2021, we project that to be $78.9 million. On the next page, or the next two pages, the 2021 budget summary by classification is that same information. It's just broken out by function. So it breaks out that information not by fund, but by what type of services is it? Is it public safety? Is it general government? Is it public works, et cetera? So this kind of gives you a little bit closer picture by department. Non-departmental has a negative in the tax levy column. That's not an error. It's because the non-departmental budget is also the budget where we record shared revenue and sales tax revenue, and then we kind of allocate that out across the county. So we put the actual levy in the other funds, but then we share all those other things, which makes it look like it's a negative. But it's just because of all those other types of revenue that are in that fund. If you see the other revenues, there's over 10.8 million there, and that's what a lot of those are attributed to. And then to continue on to the 2021 revenue highlights. This is to kind of give you a comparison of the different types of revenue, but also to give you a picture of where do most of your revenues come from. One of the things that I like to look at is a comparison of what last year's budget had for different revenues. So this year we're at 36.8 taxes. Last year, we were 36.85%. Intergovernmental revenues for this budget were at 15.51. Last year, we were 15.29. Last year, permits were 0.43. This year, they're 0.43. So they're all relatively close to where they had previously been. The most significant change is in other financing sources and note proceeds. Note proceeds last year was 2.14 and it goes to 0 because we're not planning for any debt issue. And other financing sources last year was 3.32 and it's going to 6.94. Well, the reason for that is rather than do a debt issue, we're going to use vehicle registration funds to pay for highway projects. We've been saving that money. Now we're going to use it. And that's reflective of that shift there. Otherwise, they're pretty close to what a prior year budget would look like. And that's something from my perspective that we'd want to see, that it's pretty stable. 2021 expenditures by classification, again, same kind of look. I went back and looked at where we were last year. Again, very comparable. Public Works, this year 23.27, last year was 22.16. Health and Human Services, last year 26.59, or this year 26.59, last year 27.36. General government was 2105 last year. This year it's 19.91. So very comparable in terms of where the percentages lie year over year. Expenditures by type. For 2021, contractual services is 38.64%. Last year was 38.53. Professionals or personnel services was 40.06 for the proposed budget. Last year was 41.18. The majority of the county's costs are within contractual services and personnel services year over year. The next chart, just want to make sure that we're on the same page. 2020 estimated fund balance. This is where we take into account, Dave, your question earlier, so I'll point that out. We lay out by fund. We do categorize all the special revenue funds together. So within special revenue funds, that would include your highway, roads and bridges, your health and human services, your ADRC, business park, EMS fund, jail assessment, land records. Those are all included in that figure. So for the general fund, we're starting out 2020 with 24.5 million. We estimate that we will be at 24.7 at the end of the year. Down below is the categories of fund balances, and the bottom number there under unassigned is 17.294.
Thank you.
You're welcome. 329. That's the unassigned fund balance that we expect to have at the end of this year. What that takes into account is transferring $857,566 to the capital projects fund. That still leaves us with a surplus anticipated of $412,066. So that's what we're projecting in the general fund for a surplus for 2020. In evaluating the general fund, most departments had a surplus. I think there were 5 that didn't. And the reasons for them not having a surplus were things like an employee made a change to their health insurance plan. An employee retired and we had a large sick leave conversion payout. They weren't management issues within a department. They were just things that happen over the course of the year. So every other department had a surplus. Typically they weren't planned, but a lot of the surpluses were staff vacancies. They were maybe temporary layoffs due to COVID. They were unused travel funds because we didn't travel. So there were a variety of reasons for it, but there were a lot of department surpluses. The other attributing factor to that would be we also did project the use of the routes to recovery funds for some replacement money. Law enforcement is one of the authorized categories that we can use to claim routes to recovery funds for their efforts in responding to COVID that's taking them away from their normal duties. So that kind of frees up the levy that maybe we otherwise would have spent. In all of these categories, there is a increase in the fund balance, except for the categories of debt service and capital projects. Debt service, we had some prior year premiums paid on the as part of our debt proceeds, and those are used to pay off future debt payments. So we want to take that down because that's what it should be used for. In capital projects, just by nature, once we put it in the capital projects fund, the intent is that we're going to do the project, and as we do it, we spend it down. So that's the nature of capital projects. You can see in the capital projects column in the revenue section, the bottom line says transfers in. It's got a number of $955,663. That is where that 857,566 is. The rest of that money is, I think, a transfer in from parks for the Jordan Dam repair project. I believe is the balance of that, but the majority of it is related to that general fund, those general fund transfers. Now, keep in mind that the $500,000 transfer that we projected was related to estimate. So we will look at that balance at the end of 12/31 and see where we're at. And then we will do an actual reconciliation to what it needs to be. For 2021, same chart. In all of these categories, the estimated fund balance is expected to go down from what the start of the year was. Obviously, we're not taking into account at the start of the year that we're going to have surpluses or that those kinds of things are going to happen. But what we do take into account for are uses of fund balance. So like I said earlier, we know that we're planning for the highway vehicle registration fees to be used on highway construction projects. We know that we're going to be using or budgeting contingency at HHS related to the county's COVID response because at this point in time, we lack other funding sources. We know that we're going to be purchasing 2 ambulances and some medical equipment in the EMS fund. We know that we're going to use the debt service fund balance to cover some of debt service. We know we're going to use capital to fund projects, and we know that the healthcare center has some operational needs, and we are going to use fund balance within the healthcare center. So those are kind of those known uses going forward. The next page that I kind of want to draw your attention to is we put in the budget process just for your information so that you have it. We also put in the strategic plan so that it's part of the just brief budget document. I think the next one, yep, this is the one I'm looking for. We did put in the 22 project listing of what we included in the budget to fund. These items were on the capital plan. There's nothing in here that wasn't included in the approved capital plan. It doesn't include everything though. It does not include the floor for the ADRC. And for the IT primary and disaster recovery site, that amount came down quite a bit. So we did make some tweaks based on what we knew when we went to put the budget together. You can see that overall projects are almost $2.3 million, and we plan to use just over $1.5 million in fund balance to proceed with these projects, which is what dropped our levy need to just over $553,000 to fund the projects. Just again, want to reiterate, debt service, debt outstanding for the end of 2020, 12/31/2020 will be just over 14.5 million. That includes the anticipated debt issue that we're going to do next week. And that our debt limit will give us a debt limit available of 95.6% or just over $317 million. The next page, equalized property value by municipality. This gives you a comparison of the changes year over year by municipality. The one thing that I'll point out, remember when I said earlier that your tax bill is based on your municipality? When we apportion out that 32.7 million of taxes, it will be assessed to the municipalities by the ratio in the second column from the right. So that's the share that every municipality will get as a municipality. And then from there, they have to break it up to each parcel and homeowner. So they get a total, and then from there, they break it out based on those ratios. Equalized property value and property tax. This is just a comparison through the years so you can see our history and trend. Our tax levy went up 5.05%. The rate went up 0.97%, and our equalized property value, excluding the TIDs, went up 3.91%. So that takes out the increment that the municipality is keeping that they're developing those TIDs with. Position and FTE summary. Not a lot of changes in county staffing. 3 departments had changes budget to budget. They were Health and Human Services, ADRC, and the Healthcare Center. Health and Human Services went down 3 positions and 2.87 FTE. ADRC went down 3 positions, 2.77 FTE, and Healthcare Center, because they budget on hours, they went down 3.05 FTE for a total of 8.69 FTE overall. And that is everything that I wanted to make sure that I shared with you.
Any questions for Jen? Anybody at home have any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny.
Supervisor Dodge.
As Chair of Finance Committee, I want to say that I am very impressed with the staff and how they worked this year. Getting out a budget in ordinary time is quite a feat, let alone struggling with all of the COVID issues faced by all of the departments in Portage County. So I think that we need to be grateful for the good staff that we have. And so I'll echo Matt's comments as well.
Thank you. I agree. And one of the other things I want to touch on is some of the things we talk about, roads of recovery. We've got our proposal back from Johnson Controls where we talked about putting things in the air filtration systems for the buildings with ionizers. And we've all been waiting to get through the budget to work at the next process to figure out how we can get this done and meet all of our timelines because November 6th, things have to be submitted and invoiced. They can be installed before the end of the year, so there is some time in that regard. But we are working hard at answering a lot of questions, and stay tuned to see how that all plays out. Also, we looked at new laptops to replace the Chromebooks and new software as well with the Roads of Recovery. That's in there, okay. And that's also with the software and stuff that allows us folks to vote from home. The other system that we had before ran on Windows XP and an old laptop that's, I think, 10 years old, and it's something that would have crashed. We would have been doing it with paper. It's served its purpose, but we need to look at some of the new things to the future and what that looks like. So, oh, yeah, we're covering that in executive ops tomorrow morning. Thank you. Barry Jakowski.
Thank you, Chair Hague. I was wondering if that Johnson Control bid, if there's could be a few dollars put in there to make the thermostat in here a little more sensitive on freezing it.
I'm quite comfortable. Sheriff, how are you? He's fine too. It's always been, I seen Supervisor Splinter put his jacket on as well, about halfway through, but it always seems kind of chilly in here, and most people bring a jacket or a sweater, but I come in short sleeves shirt, and so does Matt, so.
Maybe I could get $50 and I could run down to Menards.
I'll bring you a blanket next time.
I would.
Anybody else have anything?
You aren't cooling off a side of beef in one of these rooms.
No. Anybody else have anything? Anybody at home have anything? No. With that, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So move, Mr. Chair.
Motion by Barry Jakowski, seconded by Supervisor Laddick. Any other discussion? All those in favor with aye? Aye. Opposed? We're adjourned.
Videos of these meetings are available for viewing on the city's website, stevenspoint.com/videos.